right, so hello and welcome everyone. I'm Jess Lewis. I'm the Conservation Coordinator for Nature Nova Scotia. This is our monthly nature talk. It usually occurs the first Tuesday of every month, but this nature talk is occurring on the second Tuesday because of holiday schedules. Next month we'll be returning to our normal schedule. So today we're going to be doing a panel type discussion focusing on the mainland moose and the Chebucto Peninsula. Nature Nova Scotia is still working towards saving the species. We're actually raising money for a research fund, and we're just $2,000 away from getting our funding matched. And yeah, so it's been just over a year since the establishment of the recovery plan and the core habitat map was released. So we're very excited to be discussing the recovery plan as well as the moose population and what we can do to help these species at risk. So just a quick introduction for each of our panelists. We have Karen Beazley here. She's a Professor Emeritus at Dalhousie University School for Resource and Environmental Studies in Halifax, Nova Scotia. For more than 30 years, Karen's applied scholarship has focused on the ecological and philosophical basis for biodiversity conservation, spatial conservation network design, coproduction of knowledge, and conservation through reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. She is a member of the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas, member of Nova Scotia's Mainland Moose Recovery Planning Team, chair of the Nova Scotia Crown Share and Land Legacy Trust, and senior researcher in the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership. Among many other commitments and leadership roles, she's a settler, peace and friendship ally to the treaty person in Mi'kma'ki, currently living in Windsor, NS. We also have Mike Lancaster. He wears many hats. He's the executive director of the St. Margaret's Bay Stewardship Association, coordinator of the Healthy Forest Coalition, stewardship coordinator of the Winds River Watershed Environmental Organization, and the owner of a forestry and wilderness trail management and consulting company. Mike's work on the Chebucto Peninsula spans almost 2 decades with thousands of hours of field time and ranges from the coordination of formal initiatives such as the Bluff Trail Stewardship Program to a near lifetime of recreation. And lastly but not least, we have Caitlin Cunningham. She's a white settler living as an uninvited guest on unceded Mi'kmaq territory. She's a PhD candidate in the School for Resource and Environmental Studies at Dalhousie University. Her research is focused on biodiversity conservation in urban areas and considers how cities can be built so that nature may thrive alongside humans. She uses a wide range of geospatial methods to look at how different spatial patterns within cities affect wildlife populations and where, when, and how human-wildlife interactions are occurring. As we go on, each panelist will have a chance to speak on their respective experiences. I encourage our watchers to type in any questions into the text box or simply raise your hand. We will either get to you during the conversation or at the end where we have reserved 20 minutes. So just to begin, I want to start with Karen Beazley. We know you've worked on the recovery plan, and so my first question is, why is the Chebucto Peninsula not included in the recovery plan?
All right, starting right off with the tough questions I see. No, that's great. It's a really good question and one I've thought about it a lot. So I just wanted to make it clear, though, that technically all areas of mainland Nova Scotia are included in the recovery plan. They're just not all identified as core area. So, for example, all moose are endangered and therefore all of them are protected in all of Nova Scotia, whether or not they're within core protected or core area or not. So it is not necessary for moose to be located in core area or core habitat in order for them to be protected. If moose or signs of moose are found in areas where developments are proposed or licenses and things, then the fact that the moose are endangered and are protected is taken into consideration in the decisions, such as those for licensing and under environmental impact assessments and whatnot. But more to your question of why is the area not part of core habitat, there's lots of reasons for that. And personally, I mean, it received a lot of discussion by the recovery planning team. And personally, I would love to have seen it included as core habitat, and I argued for it, but I lost that battle. And in many ways, I can see the rationale for the rest of the team in coming to the decision that they did, that we all did collectively, because in the end, I'm part of the team, and this is the product we put out there. But the rationale for its exclusion has many aspects. So, for example, as I just said, any moose under the act are considered protected. So those moose in the peninsula are still protected, even though it's not core habitat. So they're not writing off those moose by not having it as core habitat. On the other hand, or also another part of the equation is that there are thought to be very few moose remaining there, and their continued persistence over time was not seen to be very likely. That they may not be a viable number of moose there, and the connections between them and other moose in mainland Nova Scotia are very minimal or tenuous. And so it wasn't seen as a very viable long-term kind of population there, especially given all the developments around the area, especially the two highways, Highway 103 and Highway 3, which kind of separate the peninsula from the rest of mainland Nova Scotia. And there's a lot of future development planned for that area, so it would be a tough fight. So that's part of the equation. The other thing is that if they did take measures to increase moose in that area, it might result in more moose vehicle collisions, which aren't good for moose or people, and also result in other kind of risks to those moose. And that area may persist as like a sink habitat where the deaths outweigh the births. And it would take some time for it to become a source habitat. There's a lot of deer in the area, and the deer carry the brainworm. So that's another major threat in the area. What to do with the deer to make the moose less threatened from the brainworm that the deer carry it, and that is fatal to moose. So with all those things considered together, it was thought that that is not the best area to think of for recovering moose in the long term, especially when we want to recover moose as a mainland-wide population. In order to be able to connect those ones to the other populations, it would be quite a task. On the other hand, enough core habitat area was able to be identified in the areas, the other concentration areas of moose. So the Tobiatic, the Cumberland Colchester region, and the Pictou Antigonish Guysborough region. So when we looked at appropriate habitat and where concentrations of moose are in the mainland, those areas seem to have a lot more promise for future recovery and connectivity between those three major ones. And if looking at those areas, enough good habitat and unroaded area could be retained and restored to support the number of moose that are being aimed at in the recovery targets. So the recovery plan aims for a minimum of 5,000 individual moose throughout mainland Nova Scotia, and sufficient habitat to support 5,000 individuals could be found in those other areas that seem to have more promise for protection and restoration over time. So those are the main things. Now, in an ideal world where biodiversity was valued as highly or higher than many other competing values, then that area would be included too, I think. And personally, my values lie that way. But in reality, out there in the political world, there's a lot of competing uses around that area. So housing, industry, transportation, energy, all those things compete with land use. So So the recovery and the bottom line, the recovery team really did not feel it could justify identifying moose core habitat area, or didn't feel they could identify more area than is actually needed to support the recovery objectives as far as the population goes. So I had a couple of images I just wanted to show that kind of helped also in terms of where the core habitat was drawn and why the other areas looked better than this one. So would it be okay for me to share my screen briefly, Jess?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, let me just see, share screen. Okay. So figure 8 is a figure that's in the recovery plan and the appendices. And you'll see all those, can you see it? All those different colors, hexagon. So there's, what this is showing is the red, yellow, and green hexagons are showing different values that consider the suitability of the habitat for moose right now in terms of how much forage area, how much thermal and security cover area, how much access to water resources. When you do a habitat suitability analysis that consider those things, the dark green areas are better habitat suitability for moose. And we don't have a whole lot of really highly suitable habitat for moose in Nova Scotia at present. But then we modeled what's the forest likely to look like 30 years from now in 2051. And then we did the habitat suitability modeling again to see how much good moose habitat would we have then. And then we combined those values. So where are the areas that are good now and good 30 years from now? We combine those two values. Then we also considered the road density. So where are the areas that have less roads, the least amount of roads, and gave those high values, because roads are a good surrogate for human activities and access and developments, and also fragmentation. So this map, color coding, is showing the darkest green areas are areas that have good habitat now, good habitat projected for 2051, and low road areas. So we're trying to pick out core habitat that overlaps the 3 concentration areas around the Tobiatic, the Antigonish, Guysborough area, and the Cobequid Mountains, and connect those, including connecting the best habitat in the least roaded areas across the province. And that's a lot of land there. To try to grab the Chebucto Peninsula also would add more land and more complications trying to get across the highways, and it's not showing up as being as valuable cells in there as some other areas. So that's a rationale. And the next figure, also in the appendices, just kind of highlights that here, showing the highest value hexagons only, not all the hexagons. So it just kind of helps highlight how much green there is in the area selected as core habitat, and how connected the core habitat is compared to how it looks in the Chebucto Isthmus, so, or Chebucto Peninsula. Yeah, long-winded answer to your question, but
Yeah, and I
there you
guess
have it.
my next question would be sort of on like, is it possible to include this area in the future? I know you sort of touched on the reasons why it wasn't included, but.
Yeah, so there are moose in the area, and those deserve the highest protection, and inclusion of core habitat may help with that, you know, just from a bargaining perspective. In the meantime, though, better surveys for moose in the area are being planned and prioritized as part of the action planning to get a better understanding of the situation, like how many moose really are there. And so, you know, if new information becomes available, then there would, you know, there could be better rationale for using that as core habitat. The recovery plan certainly does make provision for revising various recovery strategies and actions as our understanding improves with more widespread and systematic surveys for moose, because really it's not well known where exactly they are and they don't have a good database of that. So, which points to, for one thing, the need for more surveys and the need for, including citizen science kind of surveys, because it's you people around here who are seeing these moose and sign a moose, and a lot of that knowledge is not documented in ways that can be used for decision-making purposes. So I think that's something that could forward the plan moving forward. Yeah, monitoring strategies include more research to see where the moose are, and also to see what kind of habitat and other kind of characteristics seem to be associated with moose recovery versus which ones don't seem to be associated with moose recovery. And as we learn more about those kind of characteristics, then we can adjust the lines around the map, right? So the thing that's important to note, though, another thing that's important to note is that although core habitat was identified in the recovery plan and the minister had accepted the recovery plan, that core habitat has not been designated as core habitat. So, it's not really law or part of regulations or anything at this point. It's a line on a map identified by the recovery team in the recovery plan, even though the recovery plan has been accepted by the minister and is out there.
I think Rebecca had a good question there. She's wondering, what would it take to effectively connect the Chebucto Peninsula to the rest of the province for the sake of moose? Like, for example, would a wildlife overpass work? Would formal protection for all of Blue Mountain Birch Cove Lakes help?
I think we're getting into questions that are kind of pinpointed for Caitlin to answer.
Okay.
But so I think we'll have more elaboration on that later on as we move forward, Rebecca. But I will say that absolutely any and all of that would be crucial to it. Absolutely, there would have to be wildlife underpasses and overpasses and whatever can be done. Moose tend to more use overpasses than underpasses, but I guess it just all depends on how big they are. Moose need big space. But an underpass and overpass around the highways 103 and Highway 3 in particular is one thing, but you need some sort of protection for the connectivity up to and beyond those. And then where it connects to would be, quite a bit further inland, and definitely with protection of other areas that could help, like, maybe even the Ingram River watershed, and yeah, definitely Blue Mountain, Birch Cove Lakes. And we have a National Ecological Corridors program, and hopefully some of that could be used for these kind of purposes. And I have lots of hope for the future around that.
Yeah, so there's a lot of potential there. And David Patrick asks if the public are privy to recent mainland moose survey info. Do you have any information about that, or?
Is that available to the public? Is that kind of the question you're asking? Yeah, I'm not really sure. I know that Donna Crosland and the, Wildlife Division are keen to have your sightings, any kind of signs, report it in ways that include some evidence, like the photo or whatever, and the georeference location, because they do want to build a database. Now, as with any endangered species, they just don't go giving that information out without really good rationale and permissions and stuff, because poaching and other things are an issue. So I don't think they would just be generally available to the public to observe the sightings or the data.
Okay, well, I think with regards to time, I'm going to move on to Mike. And obviously, if there's any questions at the end that you feel you can answer, Karen, we'll get back to you. Thank you.
Very good, thank you.
All right, so moving on to Mike, we know you've worked a lot in the Chebucto Peninsula. So just to start, in your personal and professional opinion, what are some notable features of the Chebucto Peninsula, and are there moose in this area?
I think one of the most noteworthy and special characteristics that it is a relatively defined area, kind of St. Margaret's Bay, Halifax Harbor, and rounding kind of Sambro, Peggy's Cove. There's quite a large semblance of protected areas. Like we've got Five Bridge Wilderness Lake, that's about 8,600, Terrence Bay Wilderness Area, Rogues Roost Wilderness Area, Long Lake Provincial Park. All together, I remember I added up a few years ago, it was over 20,000 hectares of these areas that are relatively contiguous. They're not exactly connected up, but if you look at the spatial layers of where crown land or public land exists, the majority of the public land on the Chebucto Peninsula has been protected. There's that area in what's often referred to as the Purcell's Cove backlands that remains unprotected. But besides that, there's only kind of a few parcels here and there. There are some areas that are kind of HRM land that have been protected for various reasons, but there is a really large patch, and as we would all know, that's something that moose really depend upon is kind of these large areas that they have to roam around and live their life cycles in. So I think that's probably the most noteworthy characteristic, and the fact that there is a lot of development that kind of frames the peninsula on the exteriors, but in terms of the interior, there's nothing, right? There's all these kind of roads that make these broad loops, the Herring Cove and Purcell's Cove Road and the 333 Prospect and Peggy's Cove Road. They make these huge wide arcs, but in the interior, there's only really recreation that occurs within them. There's a few camps here and there that people have, but for the most part, the largest impacts are things related to recreation and hunting. So they're left relatively unharassed and undisturbed, which is something that they prefer and makes sense. Because in terms of habitat, the other component that's pretty interesting here, as David asked the question, David Patrickman and David and Nick Hill have done some work to document the special nature of some of the red oak and yellow birch drumlins that are there, which are really interesting, old growth in particular. And I've done some sampling work to further some of that as well in 2017. And there are some really interesting deciduous dominant forests there that are not super common, especially the northern red oak dominant forests. There's not a ton of that in Nova Scotia, and the ones that are old growth are quite exemplary for not really being represented across the province. There's some areas where there's red oak where their diameter at breast height exceeds 1 meter, which maybe isn't the biggest that you'd come across in terms of kind of planted trees, but in terms of wild areas of Nova Scotia, that's really uncommon to see. So I imagine kind of if you went back 200 years ago, that it was probably a pretty successful area for caribou as well, because of that, when we used to have woodland caribou. So there's definitely lots for them nutritionally, and they're not very harassed. There's not a lot, as Karen referenced earlier, they need winter refuge. I have always been a little interested in the fact that there are quite a few moose, because the area was heavily subjected to damages from a fire that occurred in I think it was the early 60s. And that burned through a lot of the older forest there. So there's a lot of kind of scrubby bedrock, especially once you're on kind of the Purcell's Cove side. A lot of that is very barrens, a lot of crowberry barrens, which are unique and uncommon in their own right. But it's not what you'd look at, as Karen said, and think, yes, this is perfect moose habitat. It doesn't really tick a lot of those boxes, and yet they're there. So to kind of answer the second part, my dog is just coming up. You might hear him ruining in the background. That was him. There's at least 5 individuals back there through the work that we've done. I've seen 2 of them personally. I've seen a large bull, and I've seen kind of a mid-sized female, and I did find a dead one just this past December, unfortunately, not from poaching. I believe it was from predation. And and I've seen, we've got a large community of volunteers that submit findings to us and submit, especially a lot of the hunters will submit trail cam photos and footage. So we've seen that there's at least 5. We know that there are quite a few out there, and just from the photos, the tracks, and the scat that we've documented over the years, that's at minimum right now as it stands. There could be a fair bit more than that, but I'm more than fully confident to say there's a minimum of 5 back there.
Okay, so it's unfortunate to hear that one of them passed away, but so you think there's 5 remaining?
That's at minimum, and there is going to be some movement back and forth across the 103, and even through, some of you may have seen it kind of went locally viral. There was a photo of one at a local school in their parking lot that is actually on it is on, I say this side because I live kind of, I can see the Five Bridge Lake Wilderness area from my windows. It is on this side of the 103. And we have documented quite a lot of work and done a lot of work, documented a lot of data north of the 103 where there's some moose concentration areas. Karen kind of partially referred to one of our campaigns that we've have been working on for a long time, and that's the Ingram River Wilderness area. And thanks to Nature Nova Scotia for doing some work to promote that as well. We've documented a lot of moose presence there. And we do assume that there is some kind of interplay and connectivity that's happening back and forth. We don't really have evidence to suggest that, but it just would kind of make sense that there's some connection that's going back and forth. So that's kind of the main reason that I'm hopeful that down the road we can help to foster greater connectivity to this isolated population to the other areas and just make that connection a little bit easier for them.
So Karen McKendry has a question. She was wondering, can you speak to the habitat suitability for deer on the Chebucto Peninsula?
Interestingly enough, like I see a ton of deer around the outskirts of the peninsula, kind of pretty much all those areas. But when you're in the interior, I've literally only seen deer twice, and that's with over 15 years of thousands of hours of time back there. So deer are not a huge presence in the interior. They are on the outskirts for sure. There's tons of deer on the outskirts. There's no question about that. But both in terms of kind of spoor, tracks, scat, and general evidence, as well as physical sightings and observations, almost none. I've seen as many moose, actually less, because I've seen two deer and 2 live moose and 1 dead moose. So I've seen more physical moose back there than I have deer, which that alone would be very uncommon for Nova Scotia as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear. Another one of the questions I had was, would this area be considered good moose habitat, or do you think they're being pushed into this area?
I think it probably would be more that they have been just kind of corralled into this area, and it is the semblance of protected areas. They've been here for a long time. Unfortunately, their numbers have quite sharply declined. In to kind of expand on David's question about is the public privy to the surveys, I remember in the 2003 survey, I think the estimation was somewhere in the realm of 25 to 35 individuals were back there. So that's quite a sharp decline. And then if you look at the recovery plan, it's a figure from, I think, the 2003 version, where it's in the new one, I have it written down, it's page 12, figure 2. It's the previous concentration areas, and that did include the Chebucto Peninsula. So there used to be quite a more substantial population back there that has suffered quite a bit of a decline. We have seen them increase in the past couple of years, though, both from reports from the public and also from my own observations. I think we do have a bit of bias to that data because every year our volunteer base grows and the number of people that submit photos to us seems to be increasing. So it's hard to fully parse out whether that is a true representation of their populations are increasing or we're just getting more reports. But based on the fact that in the survey that wasn't released but is available through those who want to seek it in the Freedom of Information Protection of Privacy portal, if you're willing to kind of dive through that over 600-page document of mostly emails and really dry stuff, I wouldn't recommend it unless you really want to know these things. the estimation for the Chebucto Peninsula was that there was either almost none or none at all. They didn't actually find one in the aerial surveys that they did. So that was, I think, 5 years ago, or actually it would be 6 years ago now. So since then, we have seen evidence of new calves, which is really nice and really interesting to see. We've seen tracks and scat of 2 separate calves. So it's, we do believe that they're increasing. We just don't really have a strong enough data set to kind of definitively say that that's the case. They do seem to be breeding here though. And maybe it's some that are crossing back and forth. We're not sure, but there are calves that are present on the peninsula occasionally.
That's great to hear. I think David Patrickin is wondering about the feasibility of importing moose from New Brunswick to increase the number and add some diversity. Can you speak on that at all?
Not too much. I mean, that's a question that always comes up with moose conservation. They would be the most genetically similar to our native population. It would be better than kind of trying to get the ones from Cape Breton, which is kind of odd at this point. But introducing ones from Newfoundland, Cape Breton, or kind of as the other ones were Alberta, right? Those would be the closest genetically speaking. So that it would make sense if you were to undertake that. That's the population that you would take them from.
Okay, Richard, I see that you raised your hand. If you want to unmute yourself, you can ask the question.
Okay, Karen, when you were talking about the reasons for not including the Chebucto Peninsula as a core area for moose recovery, one of the reasons was that there is planned development that would make the habitat, would encroach on the moose habitat. But I wonder if you or Mike could speak to the problem with that kind of reasoning. If the development involves actually taking down forest, you not only have the problem of ruining the carbon sequestration that the forest provides, but you are encroaching on habitat that needn't be encroached on. I mean, it's like this is not good habitat because we're going to plan to make it not good habitat, and there's a kind of tension there. If you really want to preserve the moose here, and there is good habitat there, then you take David's idea of getting moose into the area, other moose, so there can be genetic diversity, and also make sure that the development is contained. More people can be added and higher where there is development already, but not taking down wilderness. I'm sorry, that may be too long a question, but is it clear what I'm asking? Why?
Yeah, no, I'll just quickly say that what I was referring to is development that's already been approved, but it just hasn't happened yet. So it's kind of hard to go back on that. And so kind of the idea is generally that there's a lot of challenges for trying to connect the moose that are on the peninsula to the rest of the mainland physically through corridors and things like that. So so that's why it wasn't drawn as part of that looped connected system of core habitat, or part of the reason, not the only one. But yeah, I agree with you that the more that things would be identified as core area, the more likely we would be able to maintain it as core habitat, yeah.
Yeah, and I think one of the questions that I had for Caitlin when she does get her chance to speak is about like this area, like what does the future for Halifax look like, and is it expanding into this area? Bob, I see you have a question. Hopefully, if you want to go ahead there.
I just wanted to answer David Patrickin's question. My understanding from working for a tribal council a while back was that the moose were proposed to be imported from New Brunswick. And they had a location and everything else, and it was turned down. That's all I'll say. It was turned down by the government.
Okay, well, thank you for that insight, and thank you so much, Mike. It's great to hear that there are moose in these areas, and hopefully we can do more, like protecting the Ingram River Wilderness area to help them. So with that, I'm going to move on to Caitlin, and I'm going to start by asking you what could happen to the genetics of a population like the mainland moose if habitat connectivity was cut off?
Yeah, so genetic diversity is incredibly important for maintaining a species resilience. So the lower genetic diversity that a population has, the more vulnerable it is to a variety of threats, including diseases. So if a gene that makes an individual susceptible to a particular disease is prevalent among a particular community, that whole community as a whole can be considered particularly vulnerable. It's also a concern with the species' ability to respond to climate change, which will be a huge factor to consider going forward. And lower genetic diversity can lead to this phenomenon called inbreeding depression, where less advantageous genes just become more prevalent in a population over a short period of time, because there just aren't a lot of options for those offspring to inherit. And really what inbreeding depression acts as is kind of like an accelerator for a population that's already in trouble, or a population that's already really small. It's like stepping on the gas and just speeding off towards major problems, including extirpation or even extinction. So that's why connectivity is so important, to be able to provide more options for breeding pairs and just more options for genetic diversity. And I know that genetic diversity for the mainland moose as a whole is an issue. I don't know about the ones on the Chebucto Peninsula specifically, but I would be shocked if it wasn't an issue, just because that population is so small and that there's so many connectivity issues already. As Mike said, there's likely only a minimum of 5 in the area. And even if that's just a minimum, it's nowhere near large enough to be considered healthy from a genetic diversity standpoint over the long term. So this really highlights why restoring connectivity in that area is just so important.
So just to go back to what I said earlier, what would you say to people who wish for Halifax to continue expanding into this area, and how would that play into the spatial arrangement with regards to moose genetics and their continued population?
Yeah, I think it would be very difficult. I think even if we look at the situation with Halifax and the Chebucto Peninsula today and didn't have any future development, and as Karen mentioned, there is already some development that's been approved in that area. Just with those sets of developments already, there are so many challenges for connectivity, for moose, and for biodiversity in general in this part of the province. And while there are ways to develop in a manner that is considered biodiversity smart or better for biodiversity, sometimes no development is the smartest development. And I think with a lot of this area, that really is the answer. We, as a city, really do need to be better utilizing the land that has already been developed and considering adding density to already developed lands, building up rather than out. So I think that overall, there are a lot of challenges with this population, but that it's not hopeless, that there are still options. But the more that we develop, the more those options for the future get cut off.
So what would some of the options be to connect the Chebucto Peninsula to the rest of the province?
So because of the highways, which are one of the major challenges, you would almost certainly need to look at wildlife over or underpasses, which are structures that, just like their name implies, either go over or under the road to give wildlife safe passage across the roads. The trouble is they are very expensive, generally starting at about $1 million, but the cost can go up very quickly from there. Los Angeles just broke ground about a year ago now on what's going to be the largest wildlife crossing structure in North America, and it's expected to cost, I think, like $90 million. They are less expensive to add to roads with their initial construction stages, costs a lot more to retrofit. Not that that's an advocating for building more roads, especially in that part of the peninsula. There's already enough roads and connectivity is already tenuous enough. So really the question becomes, where is the best spot to build them?
Yeah, so like with your experience, where would you like personally put one if you could?
I honestly don't know off the top of my head. You would want to do a lot of fine scale connectivity mapping, looking at where moose are already trying to cross the roads successfully or unsuccessfully, which is a great place for community science to come into play. So folks who see moose near the roads, or if one is unfortunately hit by a car, getting that data, because moose, like most wildlife, do tend to cross in regular spots. So you can use that data to start to get an idea of where a crossing structure could go. I don't know if any such data or such research has been done in the Chebucto Peninsula. Karen might know the answer to that if anybody has started to look at that.
I will just pitch in that people have looked at it, informally at least, like Megan Pegliano had done some studies and she identified one of the potentially good options would be where that pedestrian underpass goes under the road highways already. But there are some other areas, and we did there was the workshop that many people on here participated in, sort of hosted by the Nova Scotia Crown Share Land Legacy Trust, and you're aware of that one, Caitlin, where some possible routes were conceptually laid out, and through the Halifax Green Network Plan, they have indicated some places, but those also were done kind of schematically and may not be the best places. And it seems like there is no place where you can get a good corridor through there now. But, there are some areas that are better than others. And personally, with my values, I really value biodiversity. And I think we'll see a time in the future when people value it more than they do now. So, to the extent that we can protect any kind of lands and limit developments in the areas that look like the best places for restoration, we should just go ahead and do that and come up with the money for overpasses and underpasses when we come up with the money for that. And also, potentially target private properties, even if it's for, say the city or the province to have first right of refusal when those properties are sold in the future or change hands. So, I think that sort of restoration activity would be necessary to make a adequate connection. And there's also the question of, or the possibility in the meantime, as people have already talked about, of artificial translocations, to help with that once every generation, dispersal of one individual in either direction. There's always, where there's a will, there's a way, and when you look at the cost of highways themselves, the cost of the overpass is a drop in the bucket, really. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think Karen just said a comment, but it also came to my mind immediately is that the province announced its 5-year highway improvement plan. So they're spending $1 billion on infrastructure like highway twinning, but there was no mention of wildlife overpass or underpass. So I think that's something that should probably be considered and should probably just be built into our highway systems. Go ahead, Mike.
I just wanted to add something that I forget if it was Caitlin or Karen that mentioned it earlier, that the area we're talking about moose, but the Chebucto Peninsula is good habitat for a lot of species that are currently cut off from other areas that would really require something like this. Just a few years ago, we documented for the first time in our efforts, northern flying squirrel is in the Five Bridge Lake Wilderness area as well, and they're one that, like, you somewhat disingenuously, you can make the argument that a moose, if you clear cut an area that you know that moose are there, if the moose aren't actually there, then are you harming them? Like that logic is also used for migratory birds, right? That if an area is identified with like olive-sided flycatcher in a forest, it still, that's not going to prevent it from being harvested. It's just going to prevent it from being harvested when the bird is there nesting. But with species like flying squirrel, and we've documented fisher, which are not endangered either, but probably should be. Like, these are species that they absolutely need that connectivity, especially the flying squirrel. Like it's not going to ever fly over or crawl over or under that highway, right? It's going to spend its entire life compartmentalized if it needs to, which it does kind of in the long term potentially doom them to just not having that interbreeding occurring with other populations. And it kind of just gives them a bit of a slow, agonizing death of inbreeding themselves into oblivion. So I think we kind of need to focus a little bit on, like, we've had and talked about the question of whether or not the Chebucto Peninsula is good habitat and whether or not they're just kind of corralled to be there. But to a certain extent, with a species that's as endangered as moose, it's almost a moot question to my mind, that if the moose are there and they have been there for decades, it's good moose habitat, and that needs to be a prioritization moving forward. How do we connect this area, not just for the moose, but for the sake of biodiversity? And how do we get to a place in Nova Scotia where we're saying, okay, yeah, maybe it does cost, as Caitlin said, maybe it's going to cost $45-90 million to do this, but if we're putting $1 billion into highway infrastructure, and we just kind of need to, as a society, start demanding that this is something that we can't put a price on. And maybe in some cases like this, we can put a price on it. It's going to cost X millions to do this, but the benefit that brings people is something that we really can't put a value on. Like the times that I have experienced the moose back here, one of them in particular just changed my life as an experience that I will never forget. The way that made me feel when I was probably about 30 feet away from a cow moose. It's a magical experience that it makes me sad that more people don't get to have that kind of experience in their lives. And we need to put more and more of a human value on that.
Yeah, I think that was very well said. So with that, I'm gonna open the floor to any questions. I think first I want to start with Rebecca's question, where she said, when Nature Nova Scotia conducts moose and forest related outreach in rural communities, we sometimes run into this attitude among citizens of why should we change? The city is where the environment is suffering. With much of rural NS now being moose core habitat, but the Chebucto Peninsula not, what impact do our panelists think this difference will have on public opinion on this issue across rural and urban divide? Does anybody want to take a crack at that one?
Well, I'll just quickly say, I think it's a really good point. So, yeah.
Yeah. I guess moving on, David Patrickin was wondering, Mike, if you would talk briefly about your moose browse observations on the Chebucto Peninsula and Ingram River.
Yeah, so that's something that David and I have spoken about, and I think Karen, I may have, I think I sent an email to you and Donna about this project, that it's ongoing, and we collected a lot of data, especially last year. We did kind of an additional push to collect a lot of data for it, and we're still processing it and formulating that into a report. But essentially, we've collected data from mostly on the Bluff Wilderness Hiking Trail, but in other parts of the peninsula as well, where we target specifically red maple, Acer rubrum, to document where moose have browsed the twigs, and with red maple, when you're familiar with the species, you can relatively easily count back the years of growth using the bud scale scar or leaf scar. So you can see, just because it's got an opposite growth arrangement, so the twigs just kind of it's very distinct how many years of growth each one has. So we have been documenting all the areas that contain moose browse using the metrics of is it kind of too tall for a deer to reach, or is it just much too thick for it to be possible that it was a deer? And then going from there, we tabulate, okay, we've justified the reasoning for why we think it's almost definitively a moose that did this browse, and then we count back how many years, analyzing the growth patterns, how many years ago that happened, from a range of usually, you can do a maximum of 5 years if you're lucky, but usually it's more like kind of 3 or 4 at most. So we were assigning, okay, this was moose browse, and it happened somewhere between the time of 0 to 1 years ago, 1 to 2 years ago, 2 to 3 years ago, and we've collected, I think it's in the ballpark of about 300 data points of that across the peninsula.
So just moving on to the next question. Carol says, are we fairly sure that we can preserve the mainland moose in other areas identified, following the amount of aerial spraying, clear cutting, road construction that has been going on, as well as mining and spaceport proposal? Does anybody want to comment on that?
Yeah, I would say we are not fairly sure we can restore the mainland moose, period. But we think it's worth a chance, and we think that we could if all these incredibly high priority actions and strategies are pursued immediately. They're all high priority, they're all need to be done now. So the recovery team thinks it can be done and claim that in the recovery strategy, but that it would take a tremendously concerted effort on very, very many fronts. And certainly those would include changes to practices like the one Carol mentions in her question, and many, many others. So it's a political will question, really, because the changes would have to be pretty, transformative and wide sweeping, and soon.
Yeah, I think now is the time to take action for sure. Maybe this is a question for Caitlin if she wants to take it, but Rebecca says the survival of the mainland moose in the Chebucto area seems very much linked to the need for smart, dense social housing in our largest cities. How do we pair wildlife conservation and social justice?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, and I think it really speaks to how interconnected every aspect of the climate crisis is, from biodiversity loss to the impacts on human populations, especially our most vulnerable populations, and how there really is no justice for one without the other. And I think an important aspect of that to keep in mind, particularly when we're talking about Halifax, is yes, we can continue to fight for more density in the urban core of Halifax, but if we're not doing that in a way that serves everybody, in particular creating affordable housing, we'll just have the result of ending up having to push people out of the core and into the suburbs and continuing that spatial extension of the city. So keeping that in mind, and just how linked these two subjects are, even if they don't necessarily seem like they are at face value.
Yeah, and I think we've sort of seen before of instances of the government using the housing crisis sort of like as a scapegoat to bulldoze certain areas. I'm sure everybody knows what I'm talking about, but yeah, it's very, very disheartening. Thank you for that, Caitlin. I just want to move on a little bit to Rebecca's earlier question. She's wondering if Nature Nova Scotia's supporters were to get more involved, how could they do more? Like what kinds of data could we collect, whether it's simple moose occurrence data, or could we be gathering things to benefit other research questions in this area?
Well, I think that, and Donna Hurlbert's on the call as well, and she knows that I think this way, but I think there's a tremendous role for citizen science and especially trusted groups to do sort of occurrence and presence absence kind of surveys in a systematic way in core areas. That's a huge kind of capacity bonus, you know, if people like that could get, like this group and others could get involved in that, and that way we would have a much better data set on where moose are, how many moose there are, those sort of things. I mean, there are the formal surveys being undertaken, but there's limited capacity for things like airplanes and helicopters, and when people are out and walking and things there, it's a lot easier to see things like moose pellets and hairs and, you know, carcasses that aren't giving off heat and things like that, the signs of moose. So I think that that's a tremendous thing. And if there's more evidence of moose and, you know, if the counts are going up or staying stable, that's a lot more rationale for adding the Chebucto Peninsula to core habitat or otherwise kind of increasing efforts for moose recovery there. And a lot of the kind of research that Mike was talking about, that kind of stuff would be very helpful too. So maybe Mike wants to elaborate, because it's also, you know, we're really quite uncertain what exactly moose like what habitat is good for them here in Nova Scotia, where the climate is quite different than where most of these studies have been done, which is Northern Ontario and the like, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's why we were targeting, I mean, they like to eat red maple anyways, but we were using that because we could apply both that spatial layer, but also that temporal layer of saying that they have been here 1 year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago. So it just helps to not just paint the picture of, yes, there are moose here and numerous moose, but also that this is a presence that's consistent and can be documented over an extended period of time, rather than just kind of transient here and there type of scenario, which is pretty common with a species with that much of a range.
So it sounds like maybe two of the things that we could be working towards is mobilizing citizen science efforts for one. So perhaps like teaching people how to properly identify these markings, like moose prints, moose pellets, for things like that. And potentially fundraising for an overpass or underpass. Those would probably be two main focus. So we just have 2 minutes left, but are there any final questions for our panelists? If that's it, I think that's our, unless any of you have any finishing notes.
Yeah, one thing that there was a question you had posed in when you sent the invitation that we didn't get to. It's about what about the biggest threats to moose? And, you know, we outlined them all in the recovery plan. But one thing I want to note is that since the recovery plan was done, there's been a tremendous push for the wind energy and a real fast tracking of some of those sites. And these are huge areas, and they tend to be targeting a lot of areas that are remote and at higher altitudes, which are the same areas that are good for the moose. So that's one threat that really has emerged as being more of a threat than we were kind of picturing at the time of the recovery plan. And where those wind farms are sited is a tremendously crucial issue to be looking at right now, because a lot of those are the same areas that would be the best possibility for restoring moose habitat and maintaining and restoring connectivity between moose areas. So, yeah, tricky one.
I would echo that, Karen, because in the Ingham River Wilderness area, it's actually not technically in it because we were able to work with the proponents of the project, but the Melvin Lake wind project cuts right through your identified core habitat. So we worked with them to exclude it from our proposal, but it's still right on the outskirts and right at a pinch point of where it kind of goes from the like northern Halifax County into Hants, especially East Hants. That's going to be a very crucial corridor. It's been identified as being a really good potential for wind energy, but it's probably also essential for the survival of moose. So it's a tough one, especially for people that are environmentally conscious and think about these things. It's a tough one to wrestle with and determine exactly how best to proceed and balance those competing environmental and conservation values.
Okay, well, with that, I think we're going to end the meeting. And thank you so much for joining us. And thank you especially to our panelists for bringing your expertise. Okay, thank you, everyone. I'll see you next first Tuesday of next month.
Thank you for doing this, Jess. Thanks, everyone, for coming.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.